For the second time this season, the Indiana Fever have let a rival organization make a decision they were unwilling to make themselves. This time it involves a 22-year-old rookie who never played a single regular season minute in a Fever uniform and whose departure has reignited a familiar argument about who is actually running this franchise's basketball operations. Justine Pissott was Indiana's second-round selection in the 2026 WNBA draft, taken with the 25th overall pick out of Vanderbilt. She arrived with a specific kind of resume. At 6'4", she played much of her college career as a guard, but her length and perimeter shooting made her a natural fit at forward in the professional game, a position Indiana has needed to reinforce for most of the season. She had been ranked among the top recruits in her high school class, and in her final year at Vanderbilt, she shot better than 40% from three-point range on significant volume. On paper, she was exactly the kind of front-court shooter a roster built around a high-usage lead guard is supposed to be hunting for. Indiana signed her to a player development contract, a roster mechanism that only exists because of this year's new collective bargaining agreement. Each WNBA team is permitted to carry 2 players on these deals. They allow young or unproven players to remain with an organization, practice with the team, and appear in a limited number of games without occupying one of the 12 standard roster spots. Indiana used its second development slot on Bree Hall. The first belonged to Pissott. The trade-off for the team is flexibility. The trade-off for the player is exposure. Once a development player clears an exclusive negotiating window, any other franchise in the league is permitted to extend her a standard contract offer sheet, and the player's original team is given a strict 24-hour clock to match it or lose her outright. Pissott dealt with a leg injury during the preseason, which limited how much of her game the Fever coaching staff and the wider league actually got to see. What little evidence exists is not nothing. In Indiana's preseason meeting with the New York Liberty on April 25, a game the Fever won by 18 points, Pissott played 10 minutes off the bench. She scored 8 points, made 2 of 3 attempts from beyond the arc, and added a rebound and an assist. It was a small sample, a single half of preseason basketball, but it was enough to put her shooting stroke on tape. Beyond that appearance, she did not see the floor in a game that counted. Stephanie White had previously laid out the organization's stated philosophy on development players plainly. They would only be activated to the standard roster if an injury elsewhere on the roster created the need. That explanation held until Monday, July 6, when the Las Vegas Aces tendered Pissott a standard contract offer sheet. The timing put pressure on Indiana from 2 directions at once. Tuesday, July 7 was not only the deadline for the Fever to respond to the Aces' offer, it was also the league-wide deadline for guaranteed contract to lock in for the rest of the season. Indiana had until 5 o'clock Eastern Time to make a decision that would define both Pissott's immediate future and, by extension, the front office's credibility on roster management. To keep her, the Fever would have needed to place her on the standard roster and, in all likelihood, waive a player on a non-guaranteed deal to open the space. Names like backup big Damiris Dantas and forward Grace Van Slooten were the kind of roster spots reportedly in play. Indiana let the clock run out. Pissott signed with Las Vegas. What happened next made Indiana's hesitation look worse by comparison, not better. The Aces did not hedge, did not wait, and did not treat the corresponding roster math as a problem. To create the standard roster spot Pissott's signing required, Las Vegas waived guard Chennedy Carter, who was averaging 12.2 points per game in her first season with the franchise. Carter had signed with the Aces back in April, and her fit in that locker room had reportedly been a question mark from the start. Less than 3 months later, the team moved on from a double-figure scorer to make room for a rookie who had yet to appear in a real regular season game anywhere in the league. That is not a franchise hedging its bets. That is a defending champion, coming off a Commissioner's Cup championship loss to the New York Liberty, playing shorthanded with starting guard Dana Evans still out with a leg injury, deciding that Pissott's upside was worth more than a proven scorer's floor. Las Vegas didn't need extensive game film to make that call. They had 10 minutes of preseason tape, a shooting profile, and a division rival's unwillingness to commit, and that was enough. When Stephanie White was asked to explain Indiana's side of the decision, her answer was almost disarmingly simple. She said the organization did not feel it had the ability to open a roster spot for Pissott. No mention of performance concerns. No suggestion that the coaching staff had soured on her potential. Just a stated inability, in the middle of a season already defined by roster crunches and thin depth, to make room for a player the front office had been developing since April. It is the kind of answer that resolves the immediate question of why the paperwork went the way it did, while opening up a much larger one about whether the roster was ever actually built with enough flexibility to capitalize on the kind of upside Pissott represented. That is where the frustration among Fever fans has been sharpest. Reaction to the decision has been overwhelmingly critical, with a consistent thread running through it that this is not a story about one player slipping through the cracks, but about a front office and coaching staff that fans increasingly view as unable to manage the basic mechanics of roster construction. Comments describing the organization's decision-making as flabbergasting and its senior leadership as a running joke were not isolated reactions. They reflect a broader pattern of fan sentiment that has followed this team for much of the season, an accumulating sense that opportunities to build a functional, complementary roster around the franchise's core pieces keep slipping away. Whether through inaction, indecision, or a stated lack of options that a division rival simply did not accept as a real constraint, it is worth being precise about what is verified and what is not. There is no confirmed reporting establishing exactly what role Pissot would have played had she stayed, or how her game would have translated once healthy and given real minutes. Her sample size at the professional level is a single preseason half. What is verifiable is the sequence of institutional choices around her. A team that signed her, praised her enough to use one of only 2 development slots on her, watched a division rival value her enough to strip a rotation player to sign her outright, and then explained its own inaction with a claim about roster space that the team on the other side of the transaction did not treat as an obstacle at all. The optics are made worse by the calendar. Indiana was already scheduled to travel to face the Los Angeles Sparks before turning around to face the very team that just claimed one of its own prospects. The Fever returned to Las Vegas on Sunday for the second meeting between the two clubs this season, which means the first time Pissot takes an NBA-caliber, regular-season court in a competitive setting. It may well be wearing an Aces uniform against the organization that drafted her. If that game unfolds the way the Aces are clearly betting it will, with Pissot providing shooting, length, and front-court versatility off their bench, the contrast will not require much narration. It will be sitting right there on the scoreboard and the box score, a visual reminder of a decision Indiana had every opportunity to make differently. None of this happens in a vacuum. The Fever have spent much of this season carrying outsized national attention, largely a function of the presence of a franchise cornerstone who has reshaped the league's visibility and commercial reach. That level of attention raises the stakes on every roster decision, every coaching choice, every allocation of minutes. A team built around a generational, high-usage guard has less margin for error when it comes to surrounding her with players who can shoot, space the floor, and defend across multiple positions, because the gap between a functional supporting cast and a mismatched one shows up immediately in what opposing defenses are willing to do. A 6'4" shooter with size and perimeter range is precisely the kind of piece analysts and fans alike have pointed to as scarce on this roster. Watching that type of player walk to a direct conference rival, for a stated reason the rival organization did not consider disqualifying, is the kind of outcome that turns background frustration into open criticism. There is also a league-wide dimension to this story that deserves acknowledgement, separate from how any single fan base feels about it. The development contract and offer sheet system is brand new this season, a product of the freshly ratified collective bargaining agreement, and Pissot's case is one of the first high-profile tests of how it actually functions in practice. It exists specifically to let mid-season value get exposed and captured across the league, rewarding organizations that move decisively and correctly identify talent before it fully blossoms, while punishing those that hesitate. Las Vegas, a defending champion already stacked with talent and playing without one of its starting guards, still found the appetite and the roster flexibility to act inside a 24-hour window. Indiana, in the middle of a season where every functional shooter and every inch of size matters, did not. Whether Pissot becomes a rotation piece in Las Vegas or fades into their depth chart remains to be seen. A single strong preseason half does not guarantee a professional career, and plenty of prospects with far more hype have failed to translate shooting touch into consistent regular season production. But that uncertainty is precisely why the swiftness of the Aces' decision stands out. They were not betting on a finished product. They were betting on more information than Indiana was apparently willing to gather on its own roster, on a rival's evaluation of size and shooting mechanics outweighing the absence of a lengthy track record, and on the belief that development players like Pissot are worth disrupting an already successful rotation for. The mechanics of the development contract system are worth dwelling on a little longer, because they explain exactly how a player can go from largely unseen to gone in the span of 24 hours. Before this year, a team could stash a promising rookie on a limited deal for an entire season with almost no risk of losing her to a rival, short of an outright trade. The new collective bargaining agreement changed that calculus deliberately. Once a development player clears the league's exclusive negotiating window, any of the other 11 franchises can extend a standard contract offer sheet at any point, and the clock that follows is short by design. The rule exists to punish patience that shades into inertia. It rewards organizations willing to make a call on a player's long-term value based on limited information, and it penalizes organizations that would rather wait for more certainty before committing a roster spot. Indiana had roughly a day to decide whether Pissot was worth disrupting its own roster for. Las Vegas needed less than that to decide she was worth disrupting theirs. It is also worth sitting with what the Aces actually gave up to make this move, because it undercuts any read of this as a low-stakes gamble on their end. Chennedy Carter was not a fringe piece. She was averaging better than 12 points a game in her first season in Las Vegas, on a roster that already includes one of the league's most dominant frontcourt players and a deep, veteran-heavy rotation built to win now. Waving a double-figure scorer in the middle of a playoff push on a team that had just lost a Commissioner's Cup championship game and was already missing a starting guard to injury is not the move of a franchise treating a development contract signing as a depth chart formality. It is the move of a franchise that looked at Pissot's size, her shooting profile, and the limited tape available, and concluded the swap was worth the short-term disruption to their own rotation. Whatever uncertainty remains about how Pissot's game translates to the professional level, the Aces front office effectively staked a rotation spot on the belief that the uncertainty favored them. Indiana's calculus, by contrast, never got past the stage of explaining why it couldn't act. Stephanie White's comments after the deadline passed did not point to any specific concern about Pissot's fit, her health following the preseason leg injury, or her performance in practice. The explanation began and ended with roster space, a resource every team in the league is managing under the same collective bargaining rules Indiana had a hand in negotiating. That is part of why the reaction from Fever fans has skewed less toward disappointment in Pissot's departure and more toward frustration with the organization's decision-making process itself. A single missed opportunity on a development contract player would be a minor footnote in most seasons. For a fan base that has spent much of this year watching roster and rotation decisions draw scrutiny, this is one more data point in a pattern they believe they have already identified. And the criticism reflects that accumulated frustration as much as it reflects any specific judgment about Pissot's ceiling as a player. That frustration is compounded by the position Indiana occupies in the league's attention economy this season. Every roster move gets more scrutiny when the team is built around a player whose games move television ratings and whose jersey sales move merchandise numbers league-wide. The pressure to surround a high-usage, high-gravity guard with shooters and size who can punish opposing defenses for collapsing is not an abstract preference. It is close to a structural necessity for that kind of offense to function at its ceiling. A 6'4" wing who can shoot from distance and defend multiple positions is exactly the archetype most analysts point to as scarce on Indiana's roster, which is precisely why losing one to a division rival, for a stated reason the rival organization did not treat as disqualifying, lands as more than a routine transaction. It becomes a referendum on whether the front office understands the roster-building demands of the team it has actually assembled. There is a competitive irony sitting underneath all of this that Sunday's rematch will only sharpen. The two teams already met once this season, and they will meet again in Las Vegas with Pissot now wearing an Aces uniform instead of a Fever one. If she sees the floor in that game, it will be the first time any organization outside Indiana has had a chance to evaluate her against regular season competition, and it will happen directly across from the team that drafted her, developed her for a matter of months, and ultimately declined to keep her. Box scores rarely need narration to make a point. If Pissot contributes anything meaningful in that game, the split screen of what Las Vegas gained and what Indiana let go will speak for itself far more effectively than any post-game explanation could. None of this guarantees Pissot becomes a rotation fixture for the Aces. The sample remains a single preseason half, and plenty of prospects with considerably more hype and more extensive track records have failed to hold professional-level minutes once real regular season defenses started game planning against them. But the size of that uncertainty is exactly why Las Vegas's willingness to act on it stands out as the more decisive front office move, regardless of how Pissot's career ultimately unfolds. Indiana's front office was operated with more information about her health, her practice habits, and her fit within the system than any outside evaluator had access to, and still concluded it could not find room. Las Vegas, working with less inside information but a clearer read on what they needed, found the room in less than a day. For Indiana, the Pissot situation closes with a roster spot reopened rather than filled, one player thinner at a position of need, and another data point for a fan base already primed to view front office and coaching decisions with skepticism. The organization now has the flexibility to use that reopened development slot on another prospect, a fact the team's own reporting has framed as a silver lining. Whether that framing holds up will depend on what Indiana does with the opportunity and on whether the next time a rival front office moves decisively on a player this team has been sitting on, the outcome looks any different than it did this week. It is a small transaction in the context of a full season, a single development contract rookie changing addresses in the middle of July. But small transactions are often where organizational habits show up most clearly, precisely because the stakes are low enough that a front office does not need to overthink its reasoning before explaining it publicly. Indiana's reasoning, reduced to its simplest form, was that the roster was too full to make room for a player it had spent months developing. Las Vegas's reasoning, reduced to its simplest form, was that the player was worth making room for, full roster or not. Fans watching both decisions land on the same day did not need much interpretation to draw a conclusion about which organization is currently better equipped to identify and act on value before it walks out the door. Sunday's game in Las Vegas will not settle the larger argument about Indiana's front office on its own, but it will put both decisions on the same court at the same time for the first time, and that alone guarantees the story does not end with a missed 24-hour deadline.